The marble floors of Hamilton Trust Bank gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Brandon Carter adjusted his Armani cufflinks and stepped through the revolving glass doors. At 38, the tech entrepreneur had built Carter Innovations from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But today he wore his success quietly. A tailored navy suit, modest watch, leather briefcase that spoke of professional competence rather than ostentation. The Manhattan flagship branch hummed with the quiet efficiency of old money. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany desks where private wealth managers discussed seven-figure portfolios in hushed tones. Brandon approached the main counter, his footsteps muffled by Persian rugs that had witnessed decades of American capitalism. Behind the marble counter, Rebecca Morgan's eyes narrowed as she tracked his movement. 20 years in banking had taught her to read people, or so she believed. The slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine, micro-expressions that spoke volumes about assumptions formed in seconds. "Security?" she murmured into her headset, her voice carrying just enough to reach her colleague David Brooks at the adjacent station. "We have a situation developing." Brandon reached the counter with a pleasant smile, unaware that his presence had already triggered a chain of events that would reshape not just his morning, but the very foundations of institutional bias in American banking. The irony was exquisite. A man coming to deposit $50 million being treated as a threat in the very institution where his holdings could fund entire branches. "Good morning," Brandon said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. "I'd like to discuss opening a new business account." Rebecca's response would echo through social media within hours, broadcast to millions as evidence of what many suspected but few could prove: that success, achievement, and wealth still couldn't shield a black man from the prejudices that ran deeper than marble foundations and older than crystal chandeliers. The Hamilton Trust Bank, with its legacy dating back to 1847 and its current assets under management exceeding $300 billion, was about to face a reckoning that would redefine not just their policies, but their very understanding of who held the real power in their gleaming halls of finance. Rebecca Morgan straightened her blazer and fixed Brandon with a look that had become second nature over her 20-year career. Professional skepticism masquerading as due diligence. Behind her, David Brooks leaned forward with the predatory interest of a man who'd found his entertainment for the morning. "A business account," Rebecca repeated, her tone suggesting she'd just been asked to facilitate a moon landing. "And what type of business would that be, sir?" Brandon maintained his composure, reaching into his briefcase with deliberate calm. "Carter Innovations. We're a technology consulting firm." He placed a leather portfolio on the counter, his movements measured and professional. "I'm looking to establish a primary operating account with an initial deposit of $50 million. The number hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Around them, other customers continued their transactions. Elderly Mrs. Patterson discussing her trust fund disbursement, investment banker Jonathan Mills reviewing his quarterly statements, real estate mogul Sarah Chen transferring funds for her latest acquisition, each handled with the deference reserved for established wealth. Rebecca's laugh was barely audible, more of a sharp exhale than actual mirth. $50 million, she repeated, as if testing the words for authenticity. "I see. And you said this was technology consulting?" "That's correct." Brandon's voice remained steady, though something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, but the kind of tired recognition that comes from a lifetime of proving one's worth to skeptical gatekeepers. David Brooks appeared at Rebecca's shoulder with the synchronization of a practiced dance. "Is there a problem here, Rebecca?" His question was directed at her, but his eyes remained fixed on Brandon with the intensity of a border guard examining suspicious documentation. "Mr." Rebecca paused, realizing she hadn't bothered to ask for his name, a professional oversight that spoke volumes about her assumptions. Carter. Brandon Carter. Mr. Carter claims to be depositing $50 million for a technology consulting business. The word claims carried the weight of institutional doubt, decades of systemic skepticism wrapped in professional courtesy. David's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. 50 million. That's quite a substantial amount for... He let the sentence hang, the unfinished thought more damning than any completed accusation. Brandon watched this exchange with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal behavior. In boardrooms across Silicon Valley, his word moved markets. His signature authorized acquisitions that employed thousands. Yet here, in this temple of American finance, he was being treated like a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. Perhaps, Rebecca continued, her fingers drumming against the marble surface, we should start with some verification. What's the source of these funds, Mr. Carter? The question itself wasn't unusual. Anti-money laundering protocols were standard in banking. But the tone, the public delivery, the way other customers were beginning to notice the commotion. This was theater, not procedure. Brandon reached into his portfolio again, producing a series of documents with the patience of a man who'd fought these battles before. SEC filings, audited financial statements, bank verification letters, the paper trail of legitimate American success, validated by every regulatory body that mattered. These should address your compliance requirements, he said, spreading the documents across the counter like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Rebecca glanced at the papers with the enthusiasm of someone asked to read phone book entries. These will need to be independently verified, of course. David, could you call our compliance department? We'll need a full background check on Mr. Carter's business activities. The phrase background check was delivered at a volume that ensured neighboring customers could hear. Mrs. Patterson glanced over from her trust fund discussion, her eyebrows raised in the kind of curiosity reserved for unexpected entertainment. Jonathan Mills paused his quarterly review to observe the developing drama. Brandon felt the familiar weight of public scrutiny, not the respectful attention he commanded in conference rooms, but the suspicious examination reserved for those whose success required explanation rather than celebration. Yet he remained motionless, a study in controlled composure, even as the institutional machinery of doubt began grinding into motion around him. Rebecca's fingers moved across her keyboard with deliberate slowness, each keystroke a small act of resistance against the disruption Brandon's presence represented. The verification process for large deposits like this can take several hours, she announced, her voice carrying to the growing audience of curious onlookers. Sometimes days, depending on what our investigation reveals. The word investigation hit the air like a judge's gavel. Brandon felt rather than saw the shift in the room's atmosphere, conversations growing quieter, attention gradually focusing on the drama unfolding at the main counter. He was becoming a spectacle, his dignity offered up for public consumption by a system that demanded explanation for his success. I understand compliance requirements, Brandon replied, his voice maintaining its professional timbre. However, I'd appreciate discretion during your review process. Perhaps we could discuss this privately? David Brooks stepped closer, his presence designed to intimidate rather than assist. Sir, our procedures are standard for all customers. We can't make exceptions just because someone finds our security protocols uncomfortable. The implication landed like a slap. Brandon was being positioned as the difficult one, the customer who expected special treatment, who thought the rules shouldn't apply to him. It was a masterclass in institutional gaslighting, transforming the victim of bias into the perpetrator of unreasonable demands. Security protocols, Brandon repeated slowly, his eyes moving between Rebecca and David. Around them, the ambient noise of banking activity had grown noticeably quieter. And these same protocols apply to all deposits of this magnitude. Rebecca's smile was professionally cold. Of course, Mr. Carter. Hamilton Trust Bank maintains the highest standards for all our clients. Even as she spoke, Brandon could see Mrs. Patterson completing her 7-figure trust fund transfer with nothing more than a signature and pleasant conversation. Jonathan Mills was being handed his quarterly statements with the casual efficiency reserved for valued customers. Sarah Chen's real estate transfer had been processed with the kind of streamlined service that spoke of established relationships and unquestioned legitimacy. The contrast was surgical in its precision, a lesson in how institutional bias operated not through dramatic confrontations, but through the subtle application of different standards, different procedures, different assumptions about who deserved respect and who required scrutiny. David leaned forward conspiratorially, his voice low but audible enough to carry to nearby customers. Between you and me, Mr. Carter, large cash deposits from certain types of businesses, well, they tend to raise red flags with federal regulators. I'm sure you understand our position. The phrase certain types of businesses hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brandon understood perfectly, not the compliance requirements, which were legitimate, but the underlying assumption that his success required explanation, that his wealth was somehow suspect by virtue of his presence in their marble halls. I see, Brandon said quietly, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his briefcase handle. And what type of business would that be, Mr. Brooks? The question was delivered with surgical precision, forcing David to either retreat from his implication or make his bias explicit. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, observed by a growing audience of customers and staff who sensed they were witnessing something significant unfold. Rebecca intervened before David could respond, her tone shifting to one of forced patience. Mr. Carter, perhaps it would be best if you returned tomorrow. That would give our compliance team time to properly review your documentation and ensure we can provide you with appropriate service. It was dismissal wrapped in corporate courtesy, the institutional equivalent of being told to go to the back of the line. Brandon looked around the bustling branch, at the customers conducting millions in transactions with casual efficiency, at the staff who moved with the smooth choreography of unquestioned service. Then he looked back at Rebecca Morgan, and for the first time that morning allowed himself a small smile. I think, he said quietly, I'll wait. The fluorescent lights seemed to intensify as the morning progressed, casting harsh shadows across the increasingly tense tableau at Hamilton Trust Bank's main counter. Brandon Carter remained positioned exactly where Rebecca Morgan had left him 30 minutes earlier, his leather briefcase resting beside him like a patient sentinel. His posture suggested a man comfortable with waiting, not the fidgeting discomfort of someone out of place, but the controlled stillness of someone accustomed to boardroom negotiations that stretched past midnight. Rebecca returned from her extended compliance consultation with reinforcements. Senior Manager Sarah Mitchell emerged from the executive offices like a general responding to reports of insurrection in the ranks. At 45, Sarah commanded Hamilton Trust's retail operations with the iron fist of someone who'd clawed her way up through decades of corporate warfare. Her steel-grey hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features, and her walk carried the authority of someone unaccustomed to having her decisions questioned. Mr. Carter? Sarah began, her voice carrying the kind of institutional authority that had silenced countless customer complaints over the years. I understand you've been waiting for account verification. I'm afraid our compliance department has identified several irregularities that require additional documentation. Brandon turned to face her with the fluid motion of a man whose every gesture had been refined in countless high-stakes meetings. What specific irregularities, Ms. Mitchell? Sarah Mitchell, Senior Operations Manager. She didn't extend her hand. Our initial review suggests your business structure and funding sources require enhanced due diligence under federal banking regulations, specifically the Treasury Department's guidance on high-risk account categories. The phrase was delivered with the precision of a legal document designed to intimidate through bureaucratic complexity. Around them, other customers continued their transactions with the fluid efficiency that marked legitimate banking relationships. Mrs. Patterson had departed with her trust fund disbursement completed in under 20 minutes. Another customer, a young tech entrepreneur, not unlike Brandon in age and industry, had just opened a business account for $30 million with nothing more than a handshake and wire transfer authorization. David Brooks approached with what appeared to be official documentation, though Brandon noticed the papers remained face down against his chest. Sir, federal regulations require us to report any suspicious financial activity. Given the nature of your request and our inability to immediately verify your business operations, he let the sentence hang like an unsheathed sword. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. Brandon was being positioned as potential money launderer, his success reframed as criminal suspicion. Suspicious financial activity? Brandon repeated, his voice carrying a note of academic interest, as if he were studying the phrase for a research paper. Could you specify what activities appear suspicious about establishing a business account with documented funds and comprehensive financial records? Sarah Mitchell stepped closer, her presence designed to intimidate through institutional authority. Mr. Carter, Hamilton Trust Bank has served this community for over 175 years. We've built our reputation on protecting our clients and our institution from regulatory scrutiny. When someone walks in claiming to deposit $50 million from a business we've never heard of, claims. Brandon interrupted gently. That's an interesting word choice, Ms. Mitchell. Are you suggesting my financial documentation is fraudulent? The question cut through the corporate doublespeak like a surgeon's scalpel. Sarah found herself forced to either retreat from her implication or make an accusation she couldn't substantiate. The legal implications of suggesting document fraud hung in the air between them, observed by a growing audience of customers and staff. Rebecca Morgan stepped forward to rescue her supervisor. What Ms. Mitchell means is that large cash deposits require enhanced scrutiny. Given the current regulatory environment, banks face severe penalties for insufficient due diligence. I'm sure you understand our position. But Brandon wasn't looking at Rebecca anymore. His attention had shifted to something behind them, a wall-mounted television displaying CNN's financial news coverage. The ticker at the bottom of the screen scrolled past with routine updates. Stock prices, commodity futures, corporate earnings reports. And then, almost subliminal in its brevity, Carter Innovations' Q3 earnings exceed analyst expectations, revenue up 340%. The irony was exquisite. While Hamilton Trust's staff questioned his legitimacy, the financial media was reporting on his company's extraordinary success to millions of viewers worldwide. Brandon felt a familiar sensation, the calm that preceded storms in boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made. Sarah Mitchell followed his gaze to the television, but the ticker had already moved past his company's earnings report. Mr. Carter, I'm going to have to ask you to either provide additional documentation or consider returning when you can meet our verification requirements. The phrasing was careful, not quite asking him to leave, but applying pressure that most customers would interpret as involuntary departure. Around them, the banking floor continued its rhythmic hum of commerce, but conversations had grown noticeably quieter. Staff members found reasons to walk past their location, their curiosity barely concealed behind professional facades. Brandon reached into his briefcase and withdrew his phone. The device was understated, not the latest flagship model that screamed wealth, but a professional tool that spoke of serious business. His fingers moved across the screen with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex communications. I'm going to make a call. he announced quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach Sarah and Rebecca. "I think there may be some confusion about Hamilton Trust's account opening procedures that needs clarification." The words were delivered with the kind of calm certainty that had once prompted a Fortune 500 CEO to remark that Brandon Carter never bluffed. He simply stated facts and allowed others to draw their own conclusions about the consequences of ignoring them. Sarah Mitchell's expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, threatening legal action won't change our compliance requirements. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to ask security to escort you from the premises." But Brandon wasn't calling a lawyer. The number he dialed was answered on the first ring, and his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having important calls answered immediately. "This is Brandon Carter. I need to speak with Margaret Hamilton directly. Tell her it's regarding the quarterly assessment we discussed last month." The name Hamilton hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Margaret Hamilton, CEO and majority shareholder of Hamilton Trust Bank, descendant of the founding family that had built the institution into a $300 billion empire. A woman whose decision could reshape entire financial markets with a single phone call. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes about suddenly shifting dynamics. The confident authority that had marked their treatment of Brandon began showing hairline cracks, like expensive veneer revealing cheaper wood beneath. Brandon continued his conversation in the measured tones of someone discussing quarterly earnings rather than personal grievances. "Yes, I'm currently at the Manhattan flagship branch. The assessment is proceeding exactly as anticipated." As he spoke, other customers began taking notice, not just of the confrontation, but of the professional authority in Brandon's voice. This wasn't the desperate pleading of someone in over their head, but the controlled communication of someone managing a complex operation from multiple angles. Sarah Mitchell stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the edge of panic. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we should discuss this privately in my office." But Brandon was already ending his call, his expression revealing nothing about what had been discussed or decided. He slipped the phone back into his briefcase with the same calm precision that had marked his entire interaction with Hamilton Trust's staff. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I believe someone will be joining us shortly to discuss account procedures. Until then, I think I'll continue waiting." The marble floors seemed to amplify every sound as the morning crowd thickened around Hamilton Trust's main floor. Brandon Carter maintained his position at the counter like a lighthouse, weathering an institutional storm, his presence becoming increasingly magnetic as word spread through whispered conversations and sideways glances. Rebecca Morgan's confidence had eroded with each passing minute since Brandon's phone call. She stood behind the marble barrier like a general watching enemy reinforcements arrive on distant hills, her professional composure beginning to show stress fractures that 20 years of banking experience couldn't quite conceal. Sarah Mitchell paced behind the counter with the nervous energy of someone whose authority was being challenged in ways her corporate training had never anticipated. Her steel-gray hair remained perfectly arranged, but her fingers drummed against her tablet with increasing intensity, like a pianist working through an increasingly complex composition. "Mr. Carter," Sarah announced, her voice carrying forced authority across the banking floor. "I've spoken with our security department. They've advised me that extended loitering by non-customers constitutes a violation of our facility's policy." The word loitering hit the air like a judge's gavel. Around them, legitimate customers continued their financial transactions, real estate transfers, investment consultations, trust fund disbursements, conducted with the efficient courtesy reserved for those whose presence required no explanation. Brandon turned to face Sarah with the fluid attention of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Non-customers," he repeated, his tone suggesting academic interest in the classification. "That's an interesting designation for someone seeking to establish a $50 million business relationship." David Brooks emerged from the compliance office, carrying what appeared to be official documentation, though he held the papers against his chest like classified intelligence. "Sir, our investigation has revealed several red flags regarding your business operations. Federal regulations require us to report suspicious financial activity to the appropriate authorities." The threat was delivered with theatrical precision, designed to intimidate through bureaucratic complexity. But Brandon received it with the kind of calm attention typically reserved for quarterly earnings reports, significant information requiring careful consideration rather than emotional response. "Red flags," Brandon said quietly. "Could you be more specific about what activities appeared suspicious during your investigation?" David's confidence wavered slightly under direct questioning. "Well, the nature of technology consulting, the large cash amounts, the lack of established banking relationships with major institutions." "I see." Brandon's voice carried the neutral tone of someone recording minutes at a board meeting. "And these red flags apply specifically to technology consulting businesses, or to all businesses seeking to establish accounts with large initial deposits?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Around them, other customers continued their transactions with casual efficiency that spoke of different standards, different assumptions about whose money deserved respectful handling. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her authority armor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Carter, Hamilton Trust Bank has served this community for 175 years. We've built our reputation on protecting our clients and institution from regulatory scrutiny. When someone we've never heard of walks in claiming to deposit enormous sums—" "Claims," Brandon interrupted with surgical precision. "That word keeps appearing in our conversation, Ms. Mitchell. Are you suggesting my documentation is fraudulent?" The legal implications of suggesting document fraud hung between them like an unsheathed blade. Sarah found herself forced to either retreat from her accusation or make statements that could expose the bank to significant liability. Rebecca Morgan attempted to rescue the situation. "What we're saying is that enhanced due diligence is standard procedure for high-risk accounts. Given the current regulatory environment, banks face severe penalties for insufficient verification procedures." But Brandon wasn't listening to Rebecca anymore. His attention had shifted to the television mounted behind the counter, where Bloomberg's financial coverage was cycling through market updates. The screen displayed a familiar graphic: Carter Innovation's stock performance over the past quarter, showing gains that had outperformed every major technology index. The irony was devastating. While Hamilton Trust's staff questioned his legitimacy, the financial media was broadcasting evidence of his company's extraordinary success to viewers worldwide. Brandon felt the familiar calm that preceded major corporate restructuring, the moment when all variables aligned for transformational change. Sarah Mitchell followed his gaze to the television, but the Carter Innovation segment had already transitioned to other market news. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to have to insist that you either complete our enhanced verification process or leave the premises. We can't allow disruption of normal banking operations." The phrasing was carefully constructed, not quite an order to leave, but pressure that most customers would interpret as involuntary departure. Around them, the banking floor hummed with the quiet efficiency of established wealth, but conversations had grown noticeably subdued as staff and customers alike sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Brandon reached into his briefcase and withdrew his phone again, his movements deliberate and measured. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about Hamilton Trust's customer service protocols," he said quietly. "I'm going to arrange for clarification." His fingers moved across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone managing complex operations from multiple time zones. The call connected immediately, suggesting a number that bypassed normal corporate hierarchies. "This is Brandon Carter. Please connect me to Margaret Hamilton's office immediately. Tell her the quarterly assessment has revealed significant compliance issues that require executive intervention." The words were delivered with the calm authority of someone accustomed to having important calls prioritized without explanation. Around them, the ambient noise of banking activity seemed to diminish as staff and customers alike tuned into conversations that carried the weight of institutional consequences. Sarah Mitchell's expression shifted from confident authority to something approaching concern. Margaret Hamilton, CEO and majority shareholder of Hamilton Trust Bank, a woman whose decisions affected global financial markets, wasn't someone whose attention was casually requested by walk-in customers. "Yes," Brandon continued, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone delivering quarterly earnings reports. "The assessment parameters we discussed are being exceeded. I'll need the board's immediate attention to address systemic issues we've identified." Rebecca Morgan felt something cold settle in her stomach as she processed Brandon's words. Quarterly assessments, board attention, systemic issues, terminology that suggested institutional relationships rather than customer complaints. Brandon ended his call with the same professional efficiency that had marked his entire interaction with Hamilton Trust's staff. He returned his phone to his briefcase and looked directly at Sarah Mitchell. "Someone will be joining us shortly to discuss compliance procedures," he said quietly. "Until then, I believe I'll exercise my right to wait for appropriate customer service." The marble floors seemed to amplify the sudden tension as Sarah Mitchell realized she was no longer managing a difficult customer, but potentially facing an institutional crisis that could reshape careers with the efficiency of a corporate reorganization. Around them, other customers continued their financial transactions with increasing awareness that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold, a confrontation that would either validate or challenge the assumptions upon which Hamilton Trust Bank had operated for nearly 2 centuries. The elevator chimed with the musical precision of Swiss engineering, its brass doors opening to reveal Margaret Hamilton, flanked by 3 members of Hamilton Trust's executive board. At 62, Margaret commanded global financial markets with the authority of someone whose family name had graced the bank's letterhead since before the Civil War. Her silver hair was arranged in a style that suggested boardroom gravitas rather than fashion trends, and her walk carried the confidence of someone whose decisions moved billions of dollars with casual efficiency. Behind her, Chief Operating Officer James Patterson adjusted his titanium glasses with nervous precision. Legal counsel Victoria Chen carried a leather portfolio that suggested immediate access to documentation that could reshape corporate policies within minutes. Chief Risk Officer Michael Torres moved with the alert attention of someone expecting to manage institutional crisis before lunch. The executive procession cut through the banking floor like a diplomatic convoy, their presence immediately recognizable to staff, who rarely saw C-suite leadership outside of quarterly meetings and annual shareholder presentations. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as tellers and managers tried to process why the bank's most senior executives were personally visiting the retail floor during peak operating hours. Rebecca Morgan felt her professional composure dissolve like sugar in rain as Margaret Hamilton approached their location with purposeful determination. 20 years of banking experience had never prepared her for executive scrutiny of routine customer interactions, and the implications began settling into her consciousness with the weight of career-ending decisions. Sarah Mitchell straightened her blazer with trembling fingers, her steel-gray composure cracking under the unprecedented pressure of explaining her actions to the woman who could eliminate her position with a single phone call. The confidence that had marked her treatment of Brandon Carter evaporated like morning mist under direct sunlight. Margaret Hamilton stopped directly in front of Brandon, her expression revealing nothing about the conversation that had summoned her from executive offices to the retail banking floor. Around them, other customers and staff watched with the fascinated attention typically reserved for federal investigations or celebrity appearances. "Mr. Carter," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of institutional authority that had once convinced Congress to modify federal banking regulations. "I apologize for the delay. We're ready to proceed with your assessment." The word assessment hit the banking floor like a financial earthquake. Rebecca and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke volumes about suddenly comprehending the magnitude of their misunderstanding, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that they had been treating not a potential customer, but someone whose evaluation could determine their professional futures. Brandon stood with the fluid grace of someone whose every movement had been refined through decades of high-stakes corporate theater. "Thank you for coming personally, Margaret. The assessment has been quite illuminating." His voice carried the measured tone of someone delivering findings to a board of directors rather than expressing personal grievances. Around them, the banking floor had grown unnaturally quiet as staff and customers alike recognized they were witnessing something that would be discussed in financial circles for months to come. Margaret turned to address Sarah Mitchell with the kind of attention typically reserved for quarterly earnings presentations. "Ms. Mitchell, could you explain the service protocols that were applied during Mr. Carter's visit this morning?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, offering Sarah an opportunity to either justify her actions or reveal the institutional biases that had shaped Brandon's treatment. The legal implications hung in the air like expensive perfume, detectable, significant, and potentially toxic in wrong concentrations. Sarah's voice carried a tremor that 20 years of corporate authority couldn't quite suppress. "We followed standard compliance procedures for large deposits and new business accounts. Enhanced due diligence is required under federal regulations for high-risk transactions." "High-risk transactions," Margaret repeated, her tone suggesting academic interest in the classification. "Could you specify what elements of Mr. Carter's account request qualified as high-risk under federal guidelines?" The question exposed the fundamental weakness in Sarah's position: the inability to articulate specific regulatory justifications for treatment that had been driven by assumptions rather than compliance requirements. Around them, other customers who had witnessed the morning's events began to understand they had observed institutional bias in action rather than routine banking procedures. David Brooks stepped forward with documentation he'd been carrying like classified intelligence. "Ma'am, our compliance department identified several red flags regarding the business structure and funding sources that required additional verification under Treasury Department guidelines." Margaret's attention shifted to David with the kind of focus that had once restructured entire corporate divisions. "Red flags," she said quietly. Were these same red flags applied to other business accounts opened this morning? The question hung in the air like a judicial ruling waiting for appeal. Around them, staff members who had processed other large transactions that morning, Mrs. Patterson's trust fund transfer, Jonathan Mills' investment consultation, Sarah Chen's real estate acquisition, began to recognize the differential treatment that had marked Brandon's experience. Brandon remained motionless throughout this exchange, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts or intentions. But customers and staff who had witnessed the morning's events could sense they were observing the careful documentation of institutional failure, evidence being collected with the methodical precision of someone preparing comprehensive corporate restructuring. Margaret Hamilton's next words would echo through social media within hours, quoted in financial journals and cited in diversity training seminars across the banking industry. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the banking floor, "I'd like to introduce Brandon Carter, majority shareholder of Hamilton Trust Bank and member of our board of directors, who has been conducting a confidential assessment of our customer service protocols and compliance procedures." The revelation hit the marble floors like a financial tsunami. Rebecca Morgan's face drained of color as she processed the magnitude of her morning's actions, treating the bank's owner like a suspicious character, subjecting him to discriminatory procedures, threatening him with security escort from his own institution. Sarah Mitchell's steel-gray composure shattered completely as she realized she had not only violated the bank's anti-discrimination policies, but had done so in full view of the very executive whose investment could determine the institution's future direction. David Brooks stood frozen with his compliance documentation, understanding that his morning's investigation had not uncovered suspicious financial activity, but had instead documented the systematic bias that Brandon Carter's assessment was designed to identify and address. Around them, customers and staff began to comprehend they had witnessed not a routine banking dispute, but a carefully orchestrated evaluation that would reshape Hamilton Trust's policies, procedures, and leadership structure with the efficiency of a corporate acquisition. Brandon Carter, who had endured 90 minutes of institutional discrimination with the patience of someone conducting scientific research, finally spoke. "The assessment," he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent banking floor, "has been comprehensive." The aftermath unfolded with the swift precision of corporate reorganization during hostile takeover negotiations. Margaret Hamilton's executive team moved through Hamilton Trust's flagship branch like crisis management specialists documenting institutional failure, their tablets and phones capturing evidence that would reshape not just individual careers, but the bank's fundamental approach to customer service and compliance procedures. Rebecca Morgan stood behind the marble counter like a defendant awaiting sentencing, her 20-year banking career dissolving in real time as she processed the magnitude of her morning's actions. The confidence that had marked her treatment of Brandon Carter had been replaced by something approaching existential horror, the realization that she had subjected her institution's owner to systematic discrimination while convinced she was protecting the bank's interests. "Ms. Morgan?" Margaret Hamilton's voice carried the kind of institutional authority that had once convinced federal regulators to modify banking legislation. "Your employment with Hamilton Trust Bank is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises after you surrender your access credentials and complete exit documentation." The words were delivered with surgical precision, each syllable carrying the weight of corporate finality. Around them, other customers and staff watched with the fascinated attention typically reserved for federal investigations, their morning banking routines transformed into witness testimony for institutional reconstruction. Sarah Mitchell's termination followed with the efficient brutality of quarterly earnings disappointments. 20 years of corporate climbing, performance reviews, and professional achievements eliminated with the same casual authority she had wielded against Brandon Carter just minutes earlier. "Ms. Mitchell," Margaret continued, "your supervisory failures and violation of federal anti-discrimination statutes constitute grounds for immediate dismissal and potential legal action. Your access to Hamilton Trust systems has been revoked pending investigation by our legal department." David Brooks received a temporary suspension pending comprehensive review of his compliance procedures, his morning's documentation transformed from evidence of suspicious activity into proof of systematic bias that would require months of regulatory investigation to fully address. But Margaret Hamilton's announcements were just the beginning. Brandon Carter stepped forward with the measured authority of someone whose decisions typically affected global markets rather than individual careers. "Effective immediately," Brandon announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the banking floor. "Hamilton Trust Bank will implement comprehensive anti-discrimination protocols designed by the Southern Poverty Law Center and validated by the Department of Justice. Every employee will complete mandatory sensitivity training within 30 days or face immediate termination." The institutional transformation continued with the relentless efficiency of corporate restructuring. Brandon outlined new oversight procedures, customer service protocols, and compliance measures that would be monitored by independent auditors and reported to federal regulators on a quarterly basis. "Additionally," Brandon continued, "Hamilton Trust will establish a $50 million fund to support minority-owned businesses affected by discriminatory banking practices. This fund will be administered by an independent board and will provide low-interest loans and financial services to entrepreneurs who have experienced institutional bias." Around them, customers who had witnessed the morning's events began to understand they had observed not just individual prejudice, but systemic discrimination that required comprehensive institutional response. Several began recording Brandon's announcements on their phones, understanding they were documenting corporate reform that would influence banking practices nationwide. The social media explosion began within minutes. Videos of Rebecca Morgan's discriminatory treatment contrasted with Brandon Carter's measured response spread across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, with the viral intensity reserved for content that validates widespread suspicions about institutional bias. Justice at Hamilton began trending within hours, accompanied by videos showing Brandon's calm professionalism in the face of systematic discrimination, and Margaret Hamilton's swift corporate response to documented bias. The hashtag accumulated millions of views as people shared their own experiences with banking discrimination and celebrated Brandon's methodical exposure of institutional prejudice. Financial news outlets picked up the story within hours, with Bloomberg, CNBC, and The Wall Street Journal reporting on Hamilton Trust's comprehensive policy reforms and Brandon Carter's innovative approach to addressing systemic bias through direct corporate ownership and oversight. Rebecca Morgan departed Hamilton Trust Bank in a car service that arrived with the efficiency of corporate security protocols. Her banking career concluded with the same abrupt finality that had marked her treatment of minority customers throughout her 20-year tenure. The irony was surgical. Someone who had spent decades questioning other people's legitimacy, finally having her own professional validity revoked by institutional authority. Sarah Mitchell's exit followed similar patterns, her steel-grey confidence replaced by the hollow recognition that her career had been destroyed not by external forces, but by her own systematic prejudices, finally encountering someone with the power to document and address institutional discrimination. Brandon Carter remained at Hamilton Trust Bank for another hour, working with Margaret Hamilton and the executive team to establish implementation timelines for new policies, oversight procedures, and accountability measures that would transform the institution's approach to customer service and compliance protocols. But perhaps most significantly, Brandon announced that Hamilton Trust would become the first major American bank to implement real-time artificial intelligence monitoring of customer interactions designed to identify and address discriminatory treatment before it could escalate to the systematic abuse he had documented that morning. Technology, Brandon explained to the assembled staff and remaining customers, will ensure that every person who enters Hamilton Trust Bank receives service based on their financial needs rather than their physical appearance or perceived social status. The banking floor had been transformed from a site of institutional discrimination into a classroom for corporate reform, with Brandon Carter serving as both victim and teacher, documenting bias while simultaneously implementing solutions that would prevent similar incidents across the entire Hamilton Trust network. As the morning's events concluded, customers and staff began to understand they had witnessed something unprecedented in American banking. The systematic exposure and immediate correction of institutional bias by someone with the financial power and moral authority to demand comprehensive corporate accountability. 3 hours after walking through Hamilton Trust's revolving glass doors as a suspected criminal, Brandon Carter stood in the same marble lobby as the architect of institutional transformation that would influence banking practices nationwide for decades to come. Brandon Carter stood in the transformed banking hall of Hamilton Trust, surrounded by customers and staff who had witnessed the complete reordering of institutional power within a single morning. The marble floors that had earlier echoed with discriminatory confrontation now served as a platform for reflections that would resonate far beyond the financial district. "What happened here today?" Brandon began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone whose words typically moved global markets, represents more than individual prejudice or corporate policy failure. It reveals the systematic challenges that continue to face minority entrepreneurs and professionals throughout American business institutions. His words were captured by dozens of phones, each device documenting statements that would be quoted in diversity training seminars and civil rights conferences for years to come. The morning's events had transformed routine banking transactions into a masterclass on institutional bias and corporate accountability. I was fortunate, Brandon continued, to have the financial resources and corporate position necessary to address discrimination directly. But millions of minority business owners and professionals face similar treatment without recourse, without documentation, without the power to demand institutional change. Margaret Hamilton stood beside him with the kind of attention typically reserved for quarterly earnings presentations, understanding that Brandon's remarks would define not just Hamilton Trust's reputation, but the banking industry's approach to diversity and inclusion for the foreseeable future. The policies we've implemented today, Brandon explained, represent a systematic approach to eliminating bias through transparency, accountability, and technological oversight. Every customer interaction will be monitored, every compliance decision will be documented, every service protocol will be applied consistently, regardless of customer demographics. Around them, staff members who had witnessed the morning's transformation began to understand they were participating in institutional history, the moment when Hamilton Trust Bank evolved from a traditional financial institution into a model for corporate social responsibility and anti-discrimination best practices. Brandon's announcement of the $50 million Minority Business Fund had already generated inquiries from entrepreneurs who had experienced similar discrimination at other financial institutions. Within hours, the fund's website had received thousands of applications from business owners seeking capital in environments free from institutional bias. But technology and policy alone cannot eliminate prejudice, Brandon continued, his voice carrying the kind of moral authority that had once convinced Congress to reconsider banking regulations. Lasting change requires individual commitment to recognizing our assumptions, questioning our biases, and treating every person with the dignity and respect they deserve. The educational component of Brandon's transformation plan extended beyond Hamilton Trust to include partnerships with business schools, civil rights organizations, and federal regulators interested in replicating successful anti-discrimination protocols across the financial services industry. Dr. Angela Washington from the Southern Poverty Law Center would arrive that afternoon to begin implementing comprehensive bias training for Hamilton Trust staff, while Department of Justice observers would monitor the bank's compliance with new anti-discrimination protocols for the next 2 years. Personal dignity, Brandon emphasized, should never depend on financial assets or corporate position. The respect we show each other reflects our values as individuals and as a society, not the balance in someone's bank account or the prestige of their business address. His words carried the weight of personal experience transformed into institutional wisdom, individual suffering converted into collective progress through the careful application of corporate power and moral leadership. The media coverage continued expanding throughout the afternoon, with major news outlets framing Brandon's experience as evidence of persistent institutional bias and his response as an innovative model for corporate accountability. Editorial boards at the New York Times, Washington Post, and Financial Times would publish pieces within days examining the broader implications of his methodology for addressing systematic discrimination. Change, Brandon concluded, begins with individual courage to address injustice when we encounter it, whether as victims, witnesses, or institutional leaders. Today's events demonstrate that systematic problems require systematic solutions, but they also prove that individual actions can reshape entire institutions when applied with strategic precision and moral clarity. The applause that followed was spontaneous and sustained, coming not just from customers and staff, but from passers-by who had gathered outside Hamilton Trust's windows to witness the conclusion of events that had been live-streamed across social media platforms throughout the morning. Brandon Carter had transformed personal discrimination into institutional reformation, individual prejudice into corporate policy change, and private humiliation into public education about the persistent challenges facing minority professionals in American business. As he prepared to leave Hamilton Trust Bank, the same institution where he had been threatened with security escort just hours earlier, Brandon carried with him the satisfaction of someone who had not merely survived systematic bias, but had transformed it into lasting change that would protect thousands of future customers from similar treatment. The marble floors that had witnessed his morning's humiliation now reflected the afternoon sunlight, streaming through windows that looked out on a financial district where one man's courage had reshaped institutional practices and challenged every bank to examine their own compliance with the promise of equal treatment under law. "The choice we face," Brandon Carter announced to the assembled crowd at Hamilton Trust Bank, his words carrying the authority of someone whose morning had transformed individual discrimination into institutional reformation, "is whether we will be complicit in systematic bias through our silence, or whether we will demand accountability through our actions." His phone displayed notifications showing that Justice at Hamilton had reached 15 million views across social media platforms, with videos of the morning's events being shared by civil rights leaders, business executives, and ordinary citizens who recognized the broader implications of institutional bias exposed and addressed in real time. Every time we witness discrimination and choose silence, we become participants in perpetuating the systems that deny dignity and opportunity to our fellow citizens. Brandon continued, his voice carrying to the street outside where additional observers had gathered to witness the conclusion of events that would influence banking practices nationwide. Margaret Hamilton stepped forward with documentation that would be filed with federal regulators within hours, comprehensive policy reforms, oversight procedures, and accountability measures that would make Hamilton Trust Bank a model for corporate social responsibility and anti-discrimination best practices. "Today's events," she announced, "represent Hamilton Trust's commitment to ensuring that every customer receives service based on their financial needs rather than their physical appearance or perceived social status. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form, and we will use our resources to actively combat bias throughout the financial services industry." Brandon's final announcement carried the weight of institutional transformation backed by corporate resources and moral authority. "I challenge every business leader watching these events to examine their own practices, question their own assumptions, and implement their own accountability measures. Change is not just possible, it is necessary, and it is happening today." The crowd outside Hamilton Trust Bank had grown to several hundred people, many holding signs supporting corporate accountability and equal treatment in financial services. Local news crews documented the unprecedented scene of a major bank publicly addressing institutional bias and implementing immediate reforms in response to documented discrimination. "Share this story," Brandon concluded, his words directed not just to the immediate audience, but to millions of viewers experiencing the events through social media platforms. "Make noise about injustice, demand accountability from institutions, support businesses that demonstrate commitment to equal treatment, vote for leaders who prioritize civil rights. The power to change systems belongs to all of us." The final applause was thunderous, echoing off the marble walls of Hamilton Trust Bank and spilling out onto Wall Street, where financial professionals and ordinary citizens alike had witnessed the transformation of personal discrimination into institutional accountability. As Brandon Carter walked through the same revolving glass doors that had admitted him as a suspected criminal 4 hours earlier, he carried with him the knowledge that his morning's experience had been transformed from individual humiliation into collective progress, evidence that systematic problems could be addressed through strategic action, moral courage, and the precise application of economic power. The hashtag #JusticeAtHamilton would continue trending for weeks, inspiring similar accountability efforts at financial institutions nationwide and establishing Brandon Carter as a leading voice in corporate social responsibility and anti-discrimination advocacy. But perhaps most importantly, The events at Hamilton Trust Bank demonstrated that change was not just possible, but inevitable when individuals chose courage over comfort, accountability over silence, and justice over the preservation of systematic bias. Remember, equality is not a privilege to be granted. It is a right to be protected. Act accordingly.